The richest woman in the district stood dry inside her own hospital gate, looked down at the soaked young mother kneeling in the rain on the other side of the bars, and told the gathering street that the dying boy she was begging for was a lie. Ebeli Okafor knelt on the wet ground in a thin blouse the rain had pasted to her shoulders, one hand wrapped around the cold steel of the bars, and the other pressed to her chest where, under the soaked cloth, she carried a stopped watch that had once belonged to the woman's own son. And she listened to Chief Mrs. Ifeoma Balogun, in a tailored emerald wrapper and a great deal of gold, tell a growing crowd that women like this one would say anything. Invent a grandchild. Invent a love affair with a dead man who could no longer speak for himself, all to put a hand into a rich family's pocket. The street went still the way a Lagos street rarely goes still, even in rain. The same people who for 5 years had watched Ebeli raise a boy alone and never once ask anyone for anything now stood with the rain running off their umbrellas and watched a wealthy woman call her a thief in front of all of them. And Ebeli did not scream, and she did not curse, and she did not throw herself at the closing gate. She only lifted her chin a little, the way her own mother had taught her to lift it when the world decided to be cruel, and waited to be allowed to speak. She had not wanted to come here. For 5 years she had walked past the turning that led to this hospital and never once taken it. The woman who did everything the hard, quiet, unhelped way. She had come this morning only because there was a child in a ward across the city whose heart was failing, because the surgery to save him cost a number she could not reach in 10 years of sewing, and because somewhere on the far side of this gate lived the only family on earth that shared that child's blood. She had swallowed 5 years of pride and walked through the rain to beg, and the answer had been the rain itself, a closing gate and a word, gold digger, thrown at her like a stone in front of the whole street. Ebeli Okafor was 28 years old. For 5 years she had sewn for a living in a one-room home on the mainland, bent over a manual machine that had been her mother's, taking in dresses and school uniforms and the endless small repairs of poor people's clothes, without a husband and without a single naira from the family that should have helped her, and without ever telling anyone whose son the boy really was. The other women in the compound had a name for her, half kindness and half warning to their own daughters. The proud one, they called her, because, they said, only a proud woman refuses to go and shake the tree she has every right to shake. She had not refused out of foolishness. She had refused because of a promise made to a man no longer alive to release her from it, and because of a kind of pride that was really a kind of grief wearing better clothes. The boy's father had been named Chidi Balogun, the only son of the very woman now standing dry inside the gate, though the street did not know that yet, and the family had spent 5 years making sure no one would. He had loved her in the careless, certain way of a young man who believes the world will rearrange itself around what he wants, and he had meant to bring her home to his mother. They had done the quiet thing first, a small, customary engagement in her uncle's parlor with palm wine and a handful of witnesses, because Chidi wanted it sealed before he faced the formidable Chief Mrs. Balogun, who had other plans for him. He had fastened a watch onto Ebele's wrist that night, his own steel watch, and told her, laughing, that it was a poor man's ring until he could do it properly, within the month. He died 11 days later, on the 3rd mainland bridge in the rain, when a truck lost its brakes, and the watch had stopped at the very hour they told her he was gone, as though it could not bear to keep time in a world without him. So Ebeli kept the watch, and the promise, and her silence. She had too much pride and too much grief and, if she was honest in the dark, too much fear of exactly the word that would one day be thrown at her in the rain. She told herself she would raise Chidi's son on her own 2 hands and her mother's machine, and that the boy would never want for love, even if he wanted for everything else. And for 5 years she had made that true by the sheer brutal arithmetic of her own labor, until a small heart began, quietly to fail, and arithmetic ran out. Here is the very thing this channel was built for. So let me say it to you plainly before we go on. If you have ever carried something alone that you had every right to ask help for, if you have ever swallowed your pride and gone just once to people who owed you and been called a liar and a beggar for your trouble, then you already belong here with us under the Baobab. Take one moment to subscribe to Baobab Tales, because the quiet, overlooked, hard-working people who ask for nothing until they have no choice are exactly the ones these stories are told for. And I do not want you to miss what one rich woman's lie was about to do to Abili Okafor, or what a dead man's watch and a bundle of letters were about to do right back. To understand the woman kneeling in the rain, you have to go back 5 years, to when Abili was 23 and the future was still a thing that could be planned. She had met Chidi across the counter of a small tailoring stall. When he came in laughing about a torn agbada he had ruined at a wedding and stayed far longer than the repair required. He was the son of money, and she had no illusions about what a young man like that usually wanted from a girl like her. She had been sharp with him at first, and then less sharp, and then, slowly, over months of his stubborn, gentle returning, she had let herself believe the unbelievable thing, which was that he meant it. He had told her about his mother early, the way you warn someone about a road before you ask them to walk it with you. Chief Mrs. Ifeoma Balogun had built the family hospital with her own hands out of a single clinic, had buried a husband and turned grief into granite, and she had decided long ago that her only son would marry the daughter of another big family, certainly not a seamstress from the mainland. He would handle his mother, Chidi said, laughing the way the young laugh about the immovable things they have not yet tried to move. But first, he wanted them bound where it counted, so that when he stood before her he would be standing for his wife and not merely arguing for a girlfriend. So they had done the small ceremony in her uncle's parlor on a Saturday evening, with the generator humming outside, palm wine and cola, and a list of her family's symbolic demands that Chidi met with his eyes shining. There were perhaps 9 people in that room, and one more, a quiet young man in a neat shirt, who had driven Chidi there and been asked, half in jest and half in earnest, to stand as a witness, because Chidi said a man should have someone from his own side see him do the right thing. The driver's name was Sunday. Abili had not known, that night, that the only witness from Chidi's side of the world would one day be the hinge the whole truth turned on. 11 days. That was all the time the world allowed the promise to stand before it broke it. Chidi was driving home in the rain when a fully loaded truck came down on the bridge with no brakes left in it, and a young man who had meant to be a husband within the month became, instead, a name in a newspaper, and a closed casket Abeli was not invited to stand near. The Balogun family buried their son the way the wealthy bury their grief, and Abeli grieved him alone in a borrowed black dress at the back of a church full of people who did not know her name. No one from his family knew she existed. He had not yet had the chance to tell them, and so the one thing that could have given her a place in his death, the small ceremony in her uncle's parlor, became instead a secret she carried into the rest of her life. She found out she was carrying his child 3 weeks after she buried him, and she made, that night, the decision that would shape the next 5 years. She would not go to them. She could already hear what a woman like Chief Mrs. Balogun would say to a poor pregnant girl who appeared at her gate claiming to be the dead heir's almost wife. Could see the thin envelope of money offered to make her go away, and she would rather die than have Chidi's child begin its life as a problem that was paid to disappear. So she folded the secret smaller and smaller until it fit inside her, and she had her baby in a crowded government hospital with Mama Iffy from the next room holding her hand, and she began the long arithmetic of raising him on a sewing machine. For 5 years that arithmetic held. It was not a soft life, and she never pretended it was, But it was an honest one, and there was a fierce private joy in it the gossiping women of the compound never quite saw. She fed him first and herself second, and sometimes herself not at all, and she told him stories about a father who had loved him before he was born, leaving out only the name of the family that did not know he breathed. She kept the watch in a cloth in a drawer, and the bundle of Chidi's letters tied with a length of her tailoring thread beside it. She passed their hospital on the bus sometimes, and she would look at it for a moment, and then look away. And the looking away was its own kind of wound. The wound and the pride could coexist as long as the boy was well. That was the unspoken bargain Eboli had made with her own stubbornness, that she could refuse the family for as long as her own 2 hands were enough. The bargain broke on an ordinary Tuesday, when her son, whom she had always told herself was simply a quiet child, went blue at the lips in the schoolyard and folded onto the ground, and the clinic sent them onward, and onward again, until Eboli found herself sitting in front of a kind pediatric specialist named Dr. Bassi, with a folder of pictures of her son's heart laid open on the desk between them. Dr. Bassi told her the truth gently, which did not make it lighter. There was a hole in her son's heart that should have closed in infancy and had not, and a valve that was not built the way it should have been, and the boy's body had carried it as far as it could. He would need open heart surgery, in a proper theater, with a proper team, and not in 6 months, but within weeks, because a tired heart does not wait politely. Without it, Dr. Bassi said. And then he stopped, and his not finishing the sentence was the loudest thing Eboli had ever heard. Then he told her the cost. He wrote the number on a slip of paper and slid it across the desk because some numbers are too heavy to say out loud, and Eboli looked at the figure and felt the floor of her life tilt. It was more than she would hold in 10 years of work. The tin of saved naira on her shelf would not pay for a single day of the intensive care. She tried everything else first. Her uncle wept and gave her everything in his own thin tin, which was not a tenth of it. The church took a collection that was generous and still a world away from enough. The bank looked at a seamstress with no collateral and a manual machine and said no in the polite way banks say no to the poor. And at the end of it, with the weeks Dr. Bassi had given her bleeding away one by one, Abel understood that the pride she had carried for 5 years was a luxury she could no longer afford. Because pride could not pay for a heart, and the only people on earth who could were the people who shared that heart's blood. So she went. She pressed her best wrapper flat, the watch on her wrist, and Chidi's letters in her bag, telling herself she was not going to beg for herself, she was going to fight for her son, and that there was no shame a mother could not swallow for that. She left the boy with Mama Iffy and took the long bus across the city, and the sky, heavy all morning, opened as she came to the gate. The way the sky in this part of the world will open, without warning, and turn a street to a river in minutes. She did not get past the gate. A guard stopped her, and she explained, as steadily as she could with the rain starting to come down, that she needed to see Chief Mrs. Balogun, that it was about her late son Chidi, a matter of life and death about a child. And something in the way she said the dead man's name, with a familiarity no stranger should have, made the guard hesitate, and then, against his training, go and pass the message up. Ebel waited in the thickening rain, with her bag held against her chest to keep the letters dry, and after a long while a black SUV came down the forecourt, and out of it, under a large umbrella, swept Chief Mrs. Ifioma Balagoon in emerald and gold, pausing only because she had been told a madwoman at the gate was using her dead son's name. What happened next happened fast, and in public, and it was the kind of cruelty that is worse for being calm. Eboli, soaked now, the rain running into her eyes, said it plainly, through the bars, that she had been engaged to Chidi in her uncle's parlor 11 days before he died, that she had borne his son, and that the boy, The woman's own grandson was dying and needed a surgery she could not pay for. She held the bars, and she did not weep, and she asked, simply, for help to save the boy. Chief Mrs. Balagoon looked at her for a long moment through the rain, from under her dry umbrella, with an expression that did not flicker. And then she laughed, a short, cold social laugh turned half toward the street. So they would all understand what kind of person she had found at her gate. Her son had been a great man's only heir, she said, and from the day he died, women had come. Oh, they had come. All of them suddenly engaged to him. All of them with their hands out. And she had seen them off. Every one. There was no marriage. There was no grandchild. There was only a poor woman who had read about a rich man's death and seen an opportunity, and who should be ashamed to use a sick child, if the child even existed, to climb into a family that would never have her. And then she gave the order. She told the guards to put the woman out and not to let her come back, and she said it the way you would order a stain cleaned off a wall, without heat. Which was the most frightening thing of all, and she turned her back and walked toward the warm gold light of her hospital entrance, while a guard, ashamed and obeying, drew the gate shut. And Abele Okafor was left on her knees in the rain on the wrong side of the bars, with a dead man's watch against her heart, and a dying child across the city, called a liar and a gold digger in front of a whole street that now stood watching her in the downpour. This is the moment the channel was built to make you feel, so sit with it for one breath before we go on. Because if you have ever stood on the wrong side of a gate that money built, asking only for mercy, and being handed contempt instead, then you already know exactly how cold that emerald and gold laugh felt in the rain. If you've made it this far into Ebel's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. She did not crawl, and she did not curse the closing gate, and she did not give the watching street the breaking down it half expected. She knelt a moment longer with her hand on the wet steel, and then she gathered herself up off the ground the way her mother had taught her, slowly, with her back straightening last, and she looked once at the warm gold light where the woman had gone, and she pressed the stopped watch through the wet cloth against her chest, and she walked away into the rain with her chin level, and her face streaming and unbroken. And Ebel walked the long wet road home to a son whose heart was failing, and a number she still could not reach, carrying the only inheritance she had ever accepted from the man she loved, and not yet knowing that it was about to be enough. That night was the lowest Abili had been since she buried Chidi. The room was dark and close. The rain had not stopped, and her son lay in the narrow bed breathing in the shallow, tired way that frightened her more each day. Mama Iffy sat with her a long while in the lamplight, fierce and loyal, saying a woman who could put a man's own grandson out into the rain was not a woman, but a stone. But loyalty does not pay for a heart, and when Mama Iffy had gone, Abele sat alone with the lamp and took out the watch and the letters, and for the first time in 5 years she was angry at the man who had left them to her. He had promised to handle his mother, to make her safe before the world, and then he had died on a bridge in the rain, and left her to be laughed at by that same mother. With his child dying, and his family's gate shut in her face. She pressed the cold stopped watch to her mouth, and thought, just once, with her whole exhausted heart, that perhaps she had been a fool to keep any of it. The watch, the silence, the love. And then, because her hands needed something to do that was not despair, she untied the thread from the bundle of his letters, and this time read them through, all of them, by the small flame. And it was the last one, written days before the bridge, as though some part of him had felt the thinness of the time he had left, that stopped her heart, and then started it again, beating differently. My Ebele, he had written. By the time our son is born, I will have made all of this right, and I am writing it down, in case I am clumsy or slow about the saying of it. You are my wife. We are bound, in your uncle's house, before your people and before God, and I will bind us again before mine, whatever my mother says, because she is wrong about you, and she will live to know it. The watch on your wrist is my promise. Whatever comes, no one, not my mother, not her money, not all her gates, can make that a lie, because the truth of it is in the boy himself, and a child does not lie about whose blood he carries. And if you ever have to fight them, my love, do not fight them small. Fight them with the truth, in a room where they cannot shut a gate on it. Ebel wept then in a way she had not let herself weep, not at the church, not at the gate. The man's voice reaching her across 5 years on the very night she had been ready to let him go. He had written her a shield and slid it into a bundle she would carry for 5 years without ever fully opening, and waited, from beyond his own grave, for the night she would need it badly enough to read it to the end. And there was more, because at the bottom of the last letter was a line she had skimmed past for years and now understood. Ask Sunday. He had written, he stood for me, he will always stand for me. She knew only that she would not crawl back to that gate, and she would not slink away and let the lie stand over her son. Chidi had told her not to fight them small, and there had to be a room somewhere in which the truth could not have a gate shut on it. The way to that room came, as these things so often do, through a kindness Chidi had done 5 years before and forgotten in the doing. Sunday, who still drove for the Balagoon family, had been there in the forecourt the day of the gate, parking the very SUV the matriarch swept out of, and he had recognized the soaked woman at the bars at once, and he had stood beside the car with his heart pounding, and said nothing, because a poor man who needs his job does not contradict the woman who pays him in front of a crowd. But he had heard the word she used, gold digger, and he had driven home unable to eat, because he, Sunday Ize, had stood against a wall at her engagement and watched the rich man's son do the right thing in the old words, and had clapped when it was done. He knew for a fact that it was not a lie. Sunday came to her compound 2 evenings later, after dark, and he stood at her open door turning his cap in his hands and could barely meet her eyes for shame. He told her he remembered that he had been the witness from Chidi's side, that he had watched Chidi fasten the watch she still wore onto her wrist. The saying nothing at the gate had been eating him alive, he said, and he was tired of being the kind of man who keeps quiet to keep his job. He would tell the truth, in a room, to anyone who needed to hear it. Madam could sack him, and he would find other work. But he would not stand against a wall a second time, while a man's own son was called a lie. And then he told her the thing that turned a sad story into a fight she could win. The Balagoon family trust, the great wealth Chidi had been the only heir to, was about to be read and settled at last, 5 years on, now that all the legal waiting was done, and there would be a meeting with the family's longtime lawyer, the formidable old barrister Grace Adeyemi, who had served the family for 30 years and had loved Chidi like her own. If there was anywhere the truth could stand without a gate to shut on it, Sunday said, it was that room. And there was one more name he said carefully, because it frightened him. Emeka, the matriarch's nephew, a polished man in sharp suits who had made himself useful around the family money in the years since Chidi died, and who wanted no grandchild to exist more than anyone alive, because as long as there was no heir of Chidi's blood, the trust ran through his hands. Ebeli listened to all of it standing very still, and when Sunday had finished, she did not thank him in the soft way of a woman who has been rescued. She asked the only thing that mattered. How does a poor woman get into that room? And Sunday said there was one person who could open that door, the old lawyer herself, because Barrister Grace Adeyemi cared about exactly two things in this world: the family she had served and the truth. And she would not love being lied to in her own boardroom about a child who might carry Chidi's blood. So Abeli wrote to her. Not a begging letter, because she was done begging at gates. She copied, in her careful seamstress's hand, the words of Chidi's last letter, and ended by asking only one thing: not for money, not for a place in the family, only for a chance to prove, by any test they chose, that her son was who she said he was. She gave it to Sunday to put into the old lawyer's hands, and no one else's. And then she waited, sewing through the nights to keep her hands from shaking, while across the city her son grew quieter in his bed, and the weeks Dr. Bassi had given her ran down like the last grains in a glass. Barrister Grace Adeyemi was not a woman easily moved, but she could not abide a question left unanswered, and the letter left her with one that would not let her sleep. She had loved Chidi, and she had never quite believed he was the sort to leave nothing of himself behind. She read the copied words of his last letter, and recognized, in the turn of the phrases, a voice she had known since it was a child's voice. She sent for Sunday, and watched his face the whole time he spoke the way she had watched 1,000 faces in 1,000 witness boxes. And at the end she decided that there was only one way to settle a thing like this, honestly. And it was not letters, and it was not loyalty. It was blood. She sent for Ebeli privately first, because she would not ambush her own client's family without being sure. And what Grace Adeyemi saw across the desk was not a schemer. She saw a tired woman who had carried something alone for 5 years and had come, even now, asking not for the inheritance, but only for her son's right to be known. When Grace asked whether she would submit the boy to a proper paternity test at a laboratory the family trusted, Abel said yes before the old woman had finished the sentence. She had never once feared that test. The fear had always been everyone else's. So the test was done. Quietly, a swab from the inside of a sick boy's cheek matched against what the family held of their own. And while the laboratory did its slow, careful work, Grace Adeyemi began, with a frown that deepened by the day, to look properly at the family trust she was about to read. The columns Emeka had been so helpful in managing, and the more she looked, the less she liked. Because money that should have grown had thinned, and there were transfers that wore innocent names and did not bear examining, and she began to understand why a certain nephew had been so anxious for 5 years that no child of Chidi's should ever be found. And then she waited, and said nothing, and let the matriarch and the nephew walk into their own boardroom, believing they were there to divide a dead man's fortune between themselves. The day of the reading came, and it was, fittingly, a room the Balaguns themselves had built. They gathered around a long polished table in the family's own boardroom above the hospital, the matriarch at the center in emerald and gold, the nephew Emeka beside her with his phone face down under his hand, and at the head of it the old lawyer with a thick leather folder. Chief Mrs. Balagun was composed and faintly impatient. She expected an afternoon of figures and signatures and the comfortable closing of a grief. She did not know that Sunday was waiting in the corridor, that a sealed envelope from a laboratory lay inside the folder, or that, the moment the door opened and Grace Adeyemi nodded to it, Ebele Okafor would walk into the one room in the city where a gate could not be shut on her. Ebele came in quietly, in her pressed wrapper, the watch on her wrist, and stood at the foot of the long table, and met the matriarch's eyes for the second time in her life. Chief Mrs. Balagun's face went rigid with recognition, and then with fury, and she demanded to know the meaning of bringing this gate beggar into a family meeting. And Emeka half rose beside her, his voice climbing that this was an outrage, that the woman was a known fraud and should be removed before she said another word. And Grace Adeyemi let them say all of it, the way she had let 1,000 guilty people talk themselves into a corner. And then she raised one hand, and the room went quiet, and she said, in the level voice of a woman who has the truth in a folder in front of her, that no one was being removed, and that they would all sit and listen, because she would not preside over the reading of a dead boy's trust without first settling whether that dead boy had left a living son. She did not raise her voice. The truly powerful do not need to. She read the words of Chidi's last letter aloud in that boardroom, his own voice rising off the page in the room his mother had built. You are my wife. The truth of it is in the boy himself. A child does not lie about whose blood he carries. And the matriarch's face, which had been fury, began, against her will, to be something else. She called Sunday in from the corridor, and he stood, twisting his cap, and told the room plainly that he had been the witness from Chidi's own side, that he had watched the young master kneel and ask for this woman in the old words. When Emeka tried to shout him down as a sacked servant with a grudge, Grace Adeyemi noted, dryly, that Sunday had not been sacked at all. And then the old lawyer took the sealed envelope from her folder and held it up so the whole table could see it had not been opened, and she said that letters could be forged, and witnesses doubted. And so she had done the one thing that could not be argued with. She had tested the blood. She slid the envelope down the table to the matriarch herself and asked her, with a terrible gentleness, to open it, because it was her right above anyone's to read whether the boy across the city was a stranger or her son's son. Chief Mrs. Balagoon's hands, which had ordered a woman cleaned off a gate like a stain, were not steady now. She broke the seal and unfolded the single page. And in the silence of her own boardroom, the richest woman in the district read the laboratory's plain, unarguable language, the percentages that cannot be bought, that said the dying boy across the city was, in blood and in truth, Chidi's son, her own grandson, beyond any doubt. The room did not breathe. The matriarch read it twice, and the thing that broke in her face was not her pride, though her pride broke too. It was the understanding of what she had done. She had had a grandson for 5 years and never known it, and on the one day that grandson's mother had come to her gate, asking not for money, but for the boy's very life. She had laughed at her and called the child a lie and turned her back, and the boy had been dying the whole time, was dying still, while they sat here. She looked down the long table at the woman she had called a gold digger in the rain, and she could not hold her steady eyes, because there was no contempt in them, and no triumph either, only the flat exhaustion of a mother who had been right all along and had nearly lost everything proving it. Eboli did not gloat, because it was not in her, and it had never been the point. She stood at the foot of the table with the stopped watch on her wrist, and let the silence be the apology it was, and the only thing she said, in the calm voice of a woman with nothing left to hide, was that she had not come for the trust and did not want it, that she had come to a gate in the rain for one reason only, because her son's heart was failing, and these were the only people on earth who shared his blood, and that the surgery could not wait much longer. And she said it without bitterness, which was the hardest thing of all, and it landed in that room harder than any accusation could have. It was Grace Adeyemi who turned then to the nephew, because there was a second truth in the folder. While the matriarch sat stunned with the laboratory paper in her hand, Grace opened the folder to the accounts and began to read the figures. The trust that should have grown and had thinned, the transfers with innocent names, the careful long bleeding of a dead boy's fortune through the helpful hands of the cousin who had been so anxious that no heir should ever be found. Emeka's polished face drained as the columns came out one by one, and he tried the bluster that had carried him for years, and then he stopped, because there is a point past which figures stop being deniable. The man who had shouted loudest that the grandchild was a fraud was the only true thief in the room. He had needed the boy to be a lie, because the boy being real meant the money was no longer his to quietly drain. He left that room a smaller man than he had entered it. But that was the small justice, because the room's whole attention had already turned to the larger thing, a child across the city whose heart was running out of time. Chief Mrs. Ifeoma Balogun stood up at the head of her own table, the laboratory paper still in her hand, and she was not the same woman who had laughed at a gate. She looked at Eboli the long length of the table and at first found no words. Because what does a woman say to the mother she called a liar in the rain? And then she said the only word that mattered, which was not sorry, though that came later, in private, more than once. The first word she said was where. Where is my grandson? Take me to him. And she said it already reaching for her phone, ordering, in the voice that had built a hospital, that the boy be brought into her own theater that very day. The best surgeon called in, no expense and no hour spared, because the child was a Balagoon, and the Balagoons did not let their own die for the want of a thing money could buy. They went across the city together, the matriarch and the seamstress, in the same black SUV that had once swept past a gate in the rain, and it was Eboli who led the rich woman into the small ward where her grandson lay tired and gray, and Chief Mrs. Balagoon, who had not wept at her son's grand funeral because the wealthy bury their grief in granite, sat down on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at the boy's face, which was Chidi's face, remade small, and she wept at last. 5 years too late, and just barely in time. The surgery was done 2 days later, by the surgeon the family trusted most, with Dr. Bassi at the door and Eboli in the corridor, with the stopped watch pressed against her chest, Mama Iffy beside her, and a little apart, the matriarch herself, who would not go home. It was long and frightening, and there was an hour in the middle of it Eboli would never describe to anyone. But the hole that should have closed in infancy was closed at last by hands that knew how, and the valve that had been built wrong was made right. And in the gray hours of the following morning, the surgeon came out tired and unsmiling in the careful way of surgeons. And then, only then, let the smile come, and said the words Dr. Bassi had refused to finish all those weeks before. The boy would live, the boy would run, and grow, and bury them all at a great old age, as a son should. It did not all knit together at once. These things never do. But it came. The boy mended slowly in a bright, clean room. The color came back into his lips, and the day came when he sat up and complained about the food, which made his mother weep with a joy that frightened the nurses. There were things between Eboli and the grandmother that would take a long time to soften, and some that never fully would, because some words, once said in the rain, leave a mark even after they are unsaid. But the matriarch did the things that could be done. She paid, of course, all of it, and she set the trust right, with Grace Adeyemi's steady hand on it, so that Chidi's son would one day inherit what his father had been meant to. And she did the harder thing too, coming in time not as a benefactor but as a grandmother, to learn, slowly and awkwardly and genuinely, how to be the family she had refused at a gate. Eboli did not move into the White House, though it was offered. She let her son know his grandmother and his father's people, because Chidi had wanted that, and she let the family pay for the boy's schooling and his future, because that was his by right, and she would not let pride rob him of it twice. But she kept her room and her machine and her name, and she went on sewing. In the compound where the women had called her the proud one, and the proud one she remained, though the word meant something gentler now in the mouths of neighbors who had watched her walk away from a closed gate in the rain and turn out, in the end, to have been right about everything. She found Sunday honest work, far better than driving, because Ebeli Okafor did not forget a kindness any more than the man she had loved had forgotten one. There was an evening, months after, the boy asleep and healthy in the narrow bed, when Eboli took the stopped watch and the bundle of letters out of their drawer. And she did not weep this time, and she was not angry this time. She read his last words once more. Do not fight them small. Fight them with the truth, in a room where they cannot shut a gate on it. And she understood, fully now, that he had told her exactly how to save their son 5 years before there was a son to save. She pressed to her lips the watch that had stopped at the hour he died and had kept, all the same, the one promise that outlasted him. And they were not nothing. And they had never been nothing. So here is what I would leave with you tonight, before the light goes. The world will always be quicker to believe a rich woman's word than a poor woman's tears, and quicker to shut a gate on the one who cannot fight back than to ask whether she might, just possibly, be telling the truth. But a gate built of money cannot keep out a truth carried in the blood, and the love that writes itself down before it dies has a way of reaching across the years and standing up, in a room where no gate can be shut, for the very person everyone had already condemned. They shut a gate in her face in the rain, and the rain did not break her, and the gate did not hold. So I will ask you this, and I will be reading every answer. If you had been Abile Okafor, knelt in the rain and called a liar in front of your whole street, with your child's life on the far side of a gate that money built, would you have walked back to that gate and crawled? Or would you have done what she did, gathered yourself up off the wet ground, and found the one room in the city where the truth could not be shut out? Tell me honestly which of those two women you are, the one who kneels again, or the one who stands up and proves the blood. And so the fire burns low under the old Baobab tree. Stay a while, and tell me in the comments where you watched from.